The shattered silence. The galaxy had always been a vast, peaceful expanse, with countless planets and species living in harmony. But that peace was shattered. One by one, the planets began to fall, consumed by a darkness that no one could explain. Cities crumbled, entire populations disappeared, and the sound of destruction echoed across the galaxy. The Federation's forces, once mighty and respected, were stretched thin. Their ships were no match for the invaders, whose technology was far superior. Every attempt to defend the planets ended in failure. The invaders didn't seem to care about diplomacy, nor did they offer mercy. They came without warning, attacked without hesitation, and left devastation in their wake. On one of the farthest corners of the galaxy, a planet that had always prided itself on neutrality, the High Council met in a desperate bid for answers. Their voices were strained, their faces tired. They had seen too much destruction, heard too many pleas for help, and yet they had nothing to offer in return. The galaxy was on the brink of collapse. "This is madness," said one of the council members, his voice trembling. "How many more worlds must fall before we do something?" Another council member, a woman with silver hair and deep-set eyes, shook her head. "We have tried everything. The Federation is powerless. The military has nothing left to throw at them." "What about the Deathworlders?" another voice asked from across the room. The council fell silent. The Deathworlders. The name alone sent a chill down the spine of anyone who had ever heard of them. They were the warriors of the harshest, most dangerous planets in the galaxy, planets so dangerous that life itself had to adapt or perish. They were brutal, feared, and most of all, respected. But no one dared to call on them for help. It was too risky. They did not follow the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. They had no interest in diplomacy or peace talks. They only cared about survival. Their survival, and would do whatever it took to ensure it. The room was filled with tension. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that to ask for the Deathworlders' help was to invite chaos into the galaxy. Their forces were legendary, but so was their reputation for being ruthless. A voice broke the silence. "We have no choice. We've tried everything else, and it hasn't worked. We need the Deathworlders, or we risk losing everything." Another council member, a man with a scar running down his cheek, stood. His voice was firm. "I agree. We have to reach them. It may be our last chance." The council hesitated, but the words had been spoken. The decision had been made. They would send a call, a desperate plea, to the one force that might be able to turn the tide of the war. They would reach out to the Deathworlders. But as the decision was made, a cold feeling crept over the room. They knew the risks. The Deathworlders had no alliances, no rules. They operated by their own code. If they chose to respond, the galaxy would change in ways no one could predict. A small, sleek ship in the center of the council's headquarters began to hum. It was the only ship fast enough to make the journey across the galaxy to the Deathworlders' home planet. The message had to be short, direct, and to the point. The ship's commander, an experienced officer, prepared to send the transmission. He looked down at the control panel, his finger hovering over the send button. His heart pounded in his chest. The words they had written were simple, but the weight of them was immense. "To the Deathworlders, our last hope. The galaxy is in peril. We are helpless. We need you." The officer pressed the button. In that moment, the silence in the room felt like an eternity. Every eye was fixed on the officer, waiting for any sign of a response. Would they answer? Would the Deathworlders even care? Or would they turn their backs on the galaxy, leaving them to face extinction alone? Minutes passed. The room was still. And then, the sound they had been waiting for came. A soft beep. A transmission. The officer quickly turned to the screen. The message was received. The words that followed were simple, yet filled with so much weight. "We're coming." The council members exchanged looks of shock and relief. The Deathworlders were coming. But what would their arrival mean for the galaxy? Would they be the saviors the galaxy so desperately needed, or would their brutal ways bring even more destruction? The fate of the galaxy now rested in the hands of the Deathworlders, and the galaxy would never be the same. The shattered silence. The galaxy had always been a vast, peaceful expanse, with countless planets and species living in harmony. But that peace was shattered. One by one, the planets began to fall, consumed by a darkness that no one could explain. Cities crumbled, entire populations disappeared, and the sound of destruction echoed across the galaxy. The Federation's forces, once mighty and respected, were stretched thin. Their ships were no match for the invaders, whose technology was far superior. Every attempt to defend the planets ended in failure. The invaders didn't seem to care about diplomacy, nor did they offer mercy. They came without warning, attacked without hesitation, and left devastation in their wake. On one of the farthest corners of the galaxy, a planet that had always prided itself on neutrality, the High Council met in a desperate bid for answers. Their voices were strained, their faces tired. They had seen too much destruction, heard too many pleas for help, and yet they had nothing to offer in return. The galaxy was on the brink of collapse. "This is madness," said one of the council members, his voice trembling. "How many more worlds must fall before we do something?" Another council member, a woman with silver hair and deep-set eyes, shook her head. "We have tried everything. The Federation is powerless. The military has nothing left to throw at them." "What about the Deathworlders?" another voice asked from across the room. The council fell silent. The Deathworlders. The name alone sent a chill down the spine of anyone who had ever heard of them. They were the warriors of the harshest, most dangerous planets in the galaxy, planets so dangerous that life itself had to adapt or perish. They were brutal, feared, and most of all, respected. But no one dared to call on them for help. It was too risky. They did not follow the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. They had no interest in diplomacy or peace talks. They only cared about survival, their survival, and would do whatever it took to ensure it. The room was filled with tension. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that to ask for the Deathworlders' help was to invite chaos into the galaxy. Their forces were legendary, but so was their reputation for being ruthless. A voice broke the silence. "We have no choice. We've tried everything else, and it hasn't worked. We need the Deathworlders, or we risk losing everything." Another council member, a man with a scar running down his cheek, stood. His voice was firm. "I agree. We have to reach them. It may be our last chance." The council hesitated, but the words had been spoken. The decision had been made. They would send a call, a desperate plea, to the one force that might be able to turn the tide of the war. They would reach out to the Deathworlders. But as the decision was made, a cold feeling crept over the room. They knew the risks. The Deathworlders had no alliances, no rules. They operated by their own code. If they chose to respond, the galaxy would change in ways no one could predict. A small, sleek ship in the center of the council's headquarters began to hum. It was the only ship fast enough to make the journey across the galaxy to the Deathworlders' home planet. The message had to be short, direct, and to the point. The ship's commander, an experienced officer, prepared to send the transmission. He looked down at the control panel, his finger hovering over the send button. His heart pounded in his chest. The words they had written were simple, but the weight of them was immense. "To the Deathworlders, our last hope. The galaxy is in peril. We are helpless. We need you." The officer pressed the button. In that moment, the silence in the room felt like an eternity. Every eye was fixed on the officer, waiting for any sign of a response. Would they answer? Would the Deathworlders even care? Or would they turn their backs on the galaxy, leaving them to face extinction alone? Minutes passed. The room was still, and then the sound they had been waiting for came. A soft peep. A transmission. The officer quickly turned to the screen. The message was received. The words that followed were simple, yet filled with so much weight. "We're coming." The council members exchanged looks of shock and relief. The Deathworlders were coming. But what would their arrival mean for the galaxy? Would they be the saviors the galaxy so desperately needed, or would their brutal ways bring even more destruction? The fate of the galaxy now rested in the hands of the Deathworlders, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Deathworlder response. The message had been sent, and now the galaxy waited. There was no telling what would happen next. The Deathworlders were a force unlike any other, their ways shrouded in mystery. They were not known for their kindness, nor their willingness to save others. Yet for the first time in galactic history, the call for help had been answered. Across the galaxy, on a planet that few knew existed, the Deathworlders began to prepare. Their homeworld was nothing like the peaceful planets the Federation had once protected. It was a harsh place, where only the strongest survived. The inhabitants of this world were born into brutality, raised by its violent environment. They were warriors by nature, and every day was a battle for survival. On the planet's surface, large ships began to assemble. These ships were unlike anything the Federation had seen before. Their dark, imposing silhouettes loomed in the atmosphere, casting long shadows over the barren land below. The Deathworlders did not use traditional means of transportation. Their ships were massive, designed for combat and survival, with weapons that could level entire cities. They had no use for diplomacy or peace treaties, only victory. Captain Korak stood on the bridge of the largest of these ships. His piercing gaze watched over the preparations with the calm demeanor of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His people, the Deathworlders, were not like the other civilizations in the galaxy. They had no interest in saving others, but they understood strength. They understood the need to crush threats before they could spread. And now, they had been asked for help. Korak's second-in-command, Lieutenant Vale, approached him with a datapad in hand. She glanced at the screen and then at Korak, her expression unreadable. "Captain," the message was received. "They want us to save them. The Federation has no resources left." Korak did not answer immediately. He watched the ships preparing, their engines roaring as they were fueled and outfitted with weapons. The Deathworlders had long since ceased following the rules of the galaxy. They fought only for survival, but now they were being called upon to fight for something more, a galaxy on the brink of collapse. "They're weak," Korak said finally, "and they want us to save them." Lieutenant Vale raised an eyebrow, unsure if the captain's words were a statement or a question. "Should we?" Korak turned, his eyes narrowing. "They've shown weakness, and that is the one thing that cannot be tolerated. If the galaxy falls, it will be a world of chaos. I won't let that happen." Vale nodded, understanding the unspoken words. The Deathworlders fought only when necessary, but they would not allow the galaxy to collapse. Not on their watch. "Prepare the fleet," Korak ordered. "We leave in 30 minutes." The crew went to work, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls as they readied themselves for the journey ahead. The Deathworlders were not known for their kindness or their empathy, but they were feared for their power. And now, that power would be unleashed upon the galaxy. Elsewhere, the Federation's High Council anxiously awaited the arrival of the Deathworlders. They had received the message confirming that the Deathworlder fleet was en route, but what would it mean for the galaxy? Would their arrival bring salvation, or would they bring destruction? The council was divided. Some members feared the Deathworlders would take advantage of the situation, using the galaxy's desperation as a means to gain power. Others believed that their strength was the only thing capable of saving them. The fear of the unknown loomed over the council, but one thing was certain. The Deathworlders were coming, and the galaxy would never be the same. As the Deathworlder fleet sailed through space at an incredible speed, the Federation's fleets scrambled to gather what forces they had left. They knew the stakes. If the Deathworlders chose to fight for the galaxy, it would be a war unlike any other. If they chose to leave the galaxy to its fate, the universe would fall into darkness. The Federation had no idea what they were truly dealing with. The Deathworlders were not just warriors. They were a species forged by survival, bred in the fires of a hostile world. They had fought wars, and they had survived in the most extreme environments. Now, they were coming to a galaxy on the brink of annihilation, and as the first Deathworlder ship broke through the outer reaches of the galaxy, its silhouette cast a shadow over the Federation's remaining hope. The future of the galaxy rested in the hands of these ruthless warriors. The Galactic Awakening. The Deathworlder fleet, a dark behemoth of warships, carved its path through the stars, heading toward the heart of the galaxy. Across the systems, the arrival of these ships was already sending shockwaves through every corner of the galaxy. Their reputation had long preceded them, but no one truly knew what to expect. These weren't the compassionate heroes of the galaxy. They were a ruthless, war-hardened people, and now they were coming to a galaxy on the brink of collapse. From the Federation's Central Command, the commanders and diplomats waited anxiously. Every report they received confirmed the impending arrival of the Deathworlders, but the uncertainty surrounding their intentions hung heavy in the air. What kind of help would they offer? What price would they demand for their intervention? And above all, would they even come at all? For the first time in centuries, the universe's fate rested in the hands of those who had never before been asked for help. The Deathworlders had always been a force apart, staying in the shadows of the galaxy, watching, waiting, and intervening only when it was necessary for their survival. But now, they had been summoned by those they had no allegiance to, an invitation no one in the galaxy would have ever expected. As the Deathworlder ships arrived at the borders of Federation space, the sheer scale of the fleet was almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of ships, all equipped for war and with the capacity to wipe out entire planets, hovered silently in space, their weapons systems primed. They'd waited for the Federation's response. Inside the Federation's command center, General Era, one of the few officers who had survived the last galactic conflict, watched the screens with a cold, calculating gaze. She was a seasoned strategist, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the arrival of the Deathworlders. Her mind raced, calculating every possible outcome. "They are here," General Era said quietly, though her voice betrayed no emotion. "Now, we wait." Her advisors stood by, silent and tense. Each of them understood the significance of this moment. The Deathworlders were a terrifying force, and their arrival meant the galaxy would never be the same again. But what role would they play in this? Would they be saviors, or would they decide that their own interests lay elsewhere? On the bridge of the largest Deathworlder ship, Captain Korak stood, arms crossed, watching the view of the Federation fleet below. His face was hard, his expression unreadable. To the Deathworlders, this was just another mission. But there was something different about this one. The call for help had been clear, but it also presented an opportunity to reshape the galaxy in their image, if they so desired. "Captain, we are entering Federation space," Lieutenant Vale reported. "No signs of aggression from their fleets yet." Korak nodded, his gaze still fixed on the swirling lights of distant stars. He had no doubt the Federation was watching, but the question was whether they would offer an olive branch or make a stand. "The galaxy is on the edge of a knife," Korak said, his voice low. "But we are here to tip the balance. They've called for help, but do they understand what that truly means? We don't fight for anyone but ourselves." Vale turned to him, her eyes filled with both awe and caution. "Are we going to save them?" Korak looked at her with intensity. "I didn't come here to save anyone. I came here to ensure the survival of the strong. If the galaxy falls, it falls. But if we intervene, we do so on our terms. We may be their last hope, but they'll have to pay the price." As the ships continued to close in on their destination, Korak's mind was already making calculations. There were no guarantees, no promises of safety. The Deathworlders were not heroes, nor did they expect gratitude. But they understood one thing better than anyone else: strength, survival, and the preservation of their way of life. The Federation's emissaries had made the call, but now, the Deathworlders would decide if the galaxy was worth saving, and if it was, what the cost would be. Back in the Federation's command center, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the Deathworlder ships drew closer. General Era stood before a large screen, watching as the Deathworlder fleet loomed on the horizon. They were silent, waiting. "They're here," one of her advisors whispered. "Now what?" The truth was, no one knew. The Federation had been able to anticipate many threats, but the Deathworlders were an unknown. Would they demand tribute? Would they conquer? Or, as some feared, would they simply leave the galaxy to its fate, watching from the sidelines as the Federation crumbled? They want resources, materials from the core worlds, access to Federation technology, and a say in the governance of certain territories. They want us to give them a voice in our decision-making processes. Era was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the demands. This is more than just aid. They want power. "Yes, General," the advisor confirmed. Era clenched her fists, knowing there was little choice. The galaxy was on the edge, and without the Deathworlders, it might fall to the enemy. But to give them power in return for their help, it was a dangerous gamble. The Federation's ideals of freedom and self-governance had never included outsiders influencing their decisions. "We don't have a choice," Era finally said, her voice resigned but firm. "Prepare the delegation. We'll agree to their terms." The Deathworlders were a mysterious and formidable force, and they had come with one goal: to reshape the galaxy according to their will. The Federation had asked for their help, but the price would be steep. Now, the fate of the galaxy rested not only on the shoulders of the Federation, but on the decisions of these merciless warriors who would stop at nothing to ensure their own survival. The unseen price. The Federation's delegation stood before the Deathworlder fleet, unsure of what to expect. They had agreed to the demands, but in their hearts, they all knew the cost would be more than just resources or territory. The Deathworlders had made it clear that their aid wasn't a gift. It was a transaction, and the price was steep. General Era stood at the front of the Federation's delegation, her back straight as she surveyed the Deathworlder warships looming above them. The massive ships seemed almost alive, their dark forms shifting against the stars, as though they were predators watching their prey. It was a stark reminder of the power the Deathworlders commanded. Beside her, Commander Talon, a seasoned officer with years of combat experience, spoke in a low voice. "Do you think they'll honor the deal? I've never seen anyone this ruthless. We've given them everything. What if they just take what they want and leave us to rot?" Era didn't respond immediately. Her mind was heavy with the burden of the decision they had made. The Federation had been backed into a corner. With their resources drained and their enemies closing in, they had no other option but to trust these merciless warriors. But how could they? "They'll honor the deal," Era said, her voice steady, though she didn't believe her own words. "But remember, this is just the beginning. We've opened a door to a new power dynamic, and we don't know what it will lead to." On the Deathworlder flagship, Captain Korak stood in the war room, overlooking the holographic displays of Federation territories and resource nodes. His fingers drummed the surface of the command table, his mind calculating the next moves. The Federation had given in to their demands, but the true game was just beginning. Lieutenant Vale approached him, her eyes scanning the data. "The Federation has agreed to our terms. They've handed over the resources we asked for, and they've granted us control over several key territories. But, Korak raised an eyebrow. "They've been reluctant. They agreed, yes, but I sense hesitation. They're afraid of the power they've given us." Vale continued, her voice quiet but serious. Korak looked out the large viewport of the flagship. The stars stretched out before him, infinite and cold. He could feel the weight of the galaxy pressing on him. This was more than a military campaign. It was about reshaping the very structure of power. "Their fear is justified," Korak said. They've handed us control, but they still hold on to the belief that they can take it back. We need to show them that we will not back down. If they even think for a moment that they can challenge us, the entire galaxy will be at risk. Back on the Federation's homeworld, General Era stood before a room full of high-ranking officials, the gravity of their situation becoming even more apparent with each passing moment. The Deathworlders had been given access to Federation technology, resources, and territory, but how far would they push? How much of the galaxy could they take before the Federation could no longer control the situation? One of the officials, Ambassador Soren, spoke up, his voice laced with unease. "General, we've given them everything. How do we ensure that they honor their promises? What's to stop them from taking more? From demanding control over more systems?" Era's jaw tightened. She had asked herself the same questions 1,000 times over. They'll take more. They'll always want more. The question is whether we'll be able to stop them before it's too late. The room fell silent. The harsh reality of the situation was setting in. While the Deathworlders had agreed to defend the Federation, they were also taking steps to ensure their own future dominance. This wasn't just a favor, it was an investment in their own power. "We can't stop them," Era said, her voice harsh. "We can only try to control the fallout." The Deathworlders weren't just soldiers, they were opportunists. The Federation had unknowingly handed them the keys to the galaxy. The territories they now controlled were rich with resources, and the technologies they had been granted access to could change the balance of power forever. In the depths of the Deathworlder fleet, Captain Korak prepared for the next phase of their plan. The Federation had no idea what was coming. They had given the Deathworlders a foothold, but they still believed they were in control. Korak knew the truth. Power wasn't just taken, it was earned. And he and his people had earned their place at the top. As the fleet moved through the stars, Korak's thoughts were already turning toward the future. This was just the beginning. The Federation's desperation had set a dangerous precedent, and the Deathworlders were ready to capitalize on it. The galaxy was on the brink of a new era, one where the rules of power would be rewritten. "We've only just begun," Korak muttered to himself. "Now, we take what is ours." Back on the Federation's homeworld, General Era watched as the Deathworlder ships began to move, their massive forms casting long shadows over their world. The alliance had been forged out of necessity, but it had come with a price. The Deathworlders were no longer just mercenaries. They were rulers in their own right, and the galaxy would never be the same. "Do you think we'll survive this?" Commander Talon asked quietly, his voice filled with doubt. Era looked out at the stars, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. "We have to survive," she said, her voice determined but tinged with uncertainty. "But the cost will be more than we ever imagined." As the Deathworlders' fleet moved further into Federation space, it was clear that this alliance wasn't just about survival. It was the dawn of a new era, one where the Deathworlders would be the ones calling the shots. The galaxy was changing, and no one could predict where this new power structure would lead. But one thing was certain, the Deathworlders had arrived, and they weren't leaving until they had what they came for. The Federation had made its choice, and now it would have to live with the consequences. The shifting tides of power. The stars outside the Federation's capital planet flickered like distant dreams, but inside the walls of the High Command, the reality of their situation was harsh and unyielding. The Deathworlders had settled in and taken control of the key territories they had been promised, but it was clear now that they had their sights set on far more. They were no longer just an alliance. They were an occupying force. General Era sat in the war room, a somber expression on her face as she reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The Federation had honored their side of the bargain, but the Deathworlders had begun to take more than they were entitled to. Entire sectors of space, once under Federation control, had been claimed by their brutal new allies, and there was little the Federation could do to stop them. The Deathworlders, once seen as the galaxy's saviors, were now viewed as conquerors, and General Era knew the most difficult part was yet to come. The Federation's leaders were growing uneasy. How much more could they give before they were left with nothing? "We've done everything they asked," Era muttered, more to herself than anyone else in the room. "And yet they still take." Commander Talon stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the star-strewn horizon. "The Deathworlders don't play by our rules," he said quietly. "We knew that from the start. They take what they want and leave nothing behind." Era's fingers gripped the edge of the table as she stood, her thoughts racing. The Federation had been caught in a trap. The Deathworlders had secured their own future by ensuring that no matter what happened, they would always hold the upper hand. And it wasn't just about territory, it was about control. The Federation's leaders had no choice but to keep offering more, hoping that the Deathworlders would finally deliver on their promise to protect the galaxy from the looming threat that had started it all. But Era wasn't sure how long they could keep up this facade. The Deathworlders had come to save the galaxy, but at what cost? On the Deathworlder flagship, Captain Korak paced the command deck, his boots heavy against the metal floor. He could feel the tension in the air, not just from the Federation, but from his own crew. The deal had been struck, but now, with their foothold firmly established, the Deathworlders were making plans for more. Lieutenant Vale approached, her face grim. "Captain, the Federation has begun to show signs of resistance. They're growing wary. There are whispers among their leaders about renegotiating terms." Korak didn't flinch. He had anticipated this. The Federation had always believed they were the ones in control, even after they had agreed to the terms. The Deathworlders had given them their protection, but only to gain power in return. And now that power was growing. "They fear us," Korak said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "And when you fear something, you always try to wrest control back. They'll resist, but it won't matter. Not anymore." The Deathworlders had been ruthless in their expansion. They didn't just take what they needed, they took what they could, establishing their dominance over every sector they touched. The Federation, once a mighty political and military force, now found itself at the mercy of those they had called upon for help. General Era's thoughts raced as she walked the halls of the command center, her mind flooded with doubts. Was this alliance worth it? Had they made the right decision? Could they stop the Deathworlders before it was too late? The door to her office opened, and Commander Talon stepped inside, his expression hard and cold. "We've been given the opportunity to negotiate new terms with them," Talon said. "But I don't think they'll settle for anything less than complete control. They're testing our resolve." Era nodded slowly. She had feared this moment would come, but now that it was here, she was unprepared for the weight of it. What had once been an alliance based on mutual survival had now become a power struggle. "What will we do?" Talon asked, his voice filled with quiet urgency. "We fight," Era said, her voice firm. "We fight to keep what's ours. But I'm afraid we've already lost too much to get it back." On the Deathworlder flagship, Captain Korak sat in the war room, observing the Federation's reactions. It was time to press harder, to show them that they had no other choice but to accept the new order. The Federation had brought this on themselves by calling for help, and now they would have to live with the consequences. His eyes narrowed as a new report came in. The Federation was mobilizing its forces, preparing for a confrontation. They were beginning to understand just how far the Deathworlders' reach extended. Korak smiled. "Their resistance will be short-lived," he said, his voice laced with confidence. "They've been playing at politics for too long. But when the stakes are this high, there's no room for weakness." In the Federation's high command, the situation was becoming more dire by the hour. The Deathworlders had already begun to strip their colonies of resources, and now they were threatening the heart of the Federation's power. The stakes had shifted from mere survival to total domination. But even as Era watched her world fall apart, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. Could the Federation still turn the tide? Was there any hope left? She didn't know the answer. What she did know was that the galaxy would never be the same again. And as the Deathworlders closed in, the Federation's future hung by a thread. The stage was set for the final confrontation, one that would determine the fate of the Federation and the galaxy as a whole. The Deathworlders had won the first round, but the Federation still had one chance to fight back. But even as General Era prepared her forces, she knew one truth. When the Deathworlders came, everything changed. And whether they won or lost, the galaxy would be forever scared by the price of their intervention. The final confrontation. The tension in the galaxy had reached a breaking point. As the Federation's forces assembled at the border of Deathworlder territory, a deep unease settled over the capital planet. General Era stood before a holographic map, her fingers hovering over the positions of both fleets. Her mind was filled with doubt, but her duty as a leader was clear. The galaxy was on the edge of an abyss, and one wrong move could send them tumbling into chaos. "We cannot afford to lose," she muttered under her breath, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself or the officers around her. Commander Talon, ever at her side, placed a hand on her shoulder. "We may not be able to win, but we can fight to protect what's ours." She nodded, but the words felt hollow. The Deathworlders had been unpredictable from the beginning. And now, in the heat of battle, they were about to show just how far they were willing to go. Across the galaxy, the Deathworlder fleet was ready. Captain Korak watched as the stars outside his flagship's viewports blurred with the ships of his armada, their engines roaring to life. His mind was already focused on the victory ahead, but beneath that confidence, there was something else. A recognition that their victory, however certain, would come at a high cost. "They will resist," Korak said, more to himself than to his crew. "But it's a matter of how long they can hold out. Once we strike, there will be no going back." His lieutenant, Vale, stood by him, her expression cold. "We've prepared for this. We've taken what's ours. The Federation will either submit or fall." The first exchange of fire came like a sudden storm, breaking the uneasy stillness between the two fleets. Laser beams and plasma bolts collided with shields, sending shockwaves through the vast expanse of space. The Federation's ships fought with desperation, their crews knowing that this would be their final stand. General Era stood on the bridge of her flagship, her hands gripping the command console. The alarms blared, signaling the escalating intensity of the battle. She knew the odds were slim. The Deathworlder fleet was not just powerful, they were relentless. Each ship in their fleet was a testament to their might, their crews hardened by the harshest conditions the galaxy had to offer. "Brace for impact." The voice of the navigator rang through the chaos as the Federation ship rocked from an incoming salvo. General Era's heart raced. The fear she had tried to suppress now surged through her veins. The Federation had gambled everything on this moment, and the gamble was turning into a war of attrition. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting for victory, they were fighting to dominate, and in that fight, there would be no room for mercy. Back aboard the Deathworlder flagship, Captain Korak stood firm, watching the battle unfold. The Federation was putting up a strong resistance, but he could see the cracks in their defenses. It was only a matter of time before they broke. "Their resolve is faltering," Korak said, his voice filled with anticipation. "They fight like cornered animals, but we are the hunters." Lieutenant Vale nodded, her gaze fixed on the tactical display. "Their shields are weakening. Our ships are closing in." Korak's lips curled into a smile. "Prepare for the final push. Once we break them, we'll take everything." The final battle raged on, each side pushing forward with everything they had left. But the Federation's defenses were crumbling, and the Deathworlders showed no signs of slowing down. General Era could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. Had they made a mistake? Had they given too much to their supposed allies?